Welcome to TMF Podcast. I'm your host, KP. I'm a combat military veteran from Operation Iraqi Freedom. Join me as we explore the dynamic world of leadership development and personal growth, featuring inspiring stories and expert insights. This podcast is for you. Let's forge ahead together, striving, thriving, and surviving to make every formation count. Warriors, fall in. Warriors, fall in. It's time for formation. Today, I decided to scale it back to a little bit more of a relaxing conversation. The last episode that I had was with a firefighter first responder, but also a military veteran who told us a lot about his first responder stories. And today, I want to talk about the more meditative side of things that has to do with our entire lives and our entire existence when it comes to staying in the game and keeping your mind focused. So today I have Athena Desai. She's a multifaceted healer and practitioner. She integrates Eastern medicine, life coaching, and creative expression to guide individuals through transformative healing processes. Athena, thank you for joining me on the Morning Formation today.
Thank you for having me.
You know, when I ran across your content, I was very much impressed, mainly because I recently got back into yoga. And for most masculine dudes, that wouldn't really necessarily be a thing. But I really believe that getting into something like that is great for the human body and the human mind, mainly because it forces us to turn our phones off and to turn the world off for at least 1 hour out of your entire week, or a couple times a week if you go more than once. And it also helps us with our breathing and focusing on ourselves. So I just want to give you an opportunity to kind of talk about yourself a little bit and where you're from and what you're about.
Sure. Well, I am a holistic trauma specialist, so I specialize in trauma through a bunch of different methods, acupuncture, herbal and plant medicine, shamanic medicine, Reiki, trauma-informed yoga, and coaching. And yeah, I grew up in upstate New York, not so far from here. I'm in Massachusetts now. And I'm a first-generation American, so my parents and I have traveled the world quite a bit. And my dad's from India, my mom's from the Philippines, and I was never really 100% all one thing except for American, oddly. So I think that opened my mind to studying lots of different things and just why people do what they do. I've always been so fascinated by that. And I was actually in broadcast journalism before this. I was a radio journalist at NPR, and I got pretty sick and had that wake-up call. I had to kind of be listening to my body in a way that I never had before, and make some changes. And Chinese medicine helped me out so much in that. So that's what I kind of turned towards.
Now, prior to that, were you involved in any Eastern medicine?
Let's see. So I started doing acupuncture as a patient in 2000. Both my parents are doctors. I come from a family of doctors. So I don't think I had really explored Eastern medicine as such. Eastern philosophy, for sure, always really important to my dad, who's a Hindu. And my parents love books and learning, and definitely imparted that to me as I was growing up. So,
do you think some people need to go through a difficult time in their lives and are kind of forced to choose sort of like a crossroad or a Y intersection on which direction to go? Either you go down the pain medication route, or you go more towards the meditative route. And the reason I say that is because from personal experience, I was diagnosed at a young age with ulcerative colitis, and which is a digestive issue that folks can have, and a lot of young folks suffer from it today. And doctors really can't pinpoint where it comes from or why it happens. And I know for me, mine was more stress induced than anything else. So it sounds like you kind of went through that as well.
Yeah, I think it's impossible to overstate the connection between our minds, our emotional states, and our trauma and the health of our body, our physicality. I hear you about that, stress inducing that for you. And it was one of the things I fell in love with Chinese medicine, and actually have found it quite helpful in treating veterans. I started treating veterans in the beginning of my practice 12 years ago, and kind of fell in love with it. So you can always address multiple levels and layers of what's going on, right? People can come in with pain or dysfunction. And whether you talk about it or not, you can, because it's working with the energy and the whole person and all of their systems, it's always a way to be able to figure out, why do you have this thing at this time? What is it trying to tell you? Right. Usually our bodies are trying to have us live differently. Right. And sometimes we can have a lot of agency around that and choose as you proposed. And sometimes when you're a kid, it's not really clear what the choices are or what to do. So there's a lot of sort of pulling back the layers on that when we work on that stuff as adults.
I always tell people all the time that if you don't listen to your body, your mind and your body has a way of stopping you from doing whatever. And that's what happened to me. Like like everything, my busy schedule, my busy life came to a complete halt. And I had to figure it out. And the one thing that I learned, that sometimes medicine can be nothing more than a Band-Aid. And it's really up here and in here that needs to be taken care of and nourished. But as I was looking through your materials, I saw that your career had spanned different roles as far as a musician, writer, and an anthropologist, as we talked about before this, right? And a journalist. So how have all those different experiences that you've gone through influenced your approach to healing and your creation of soulful healing and counseling?
Yeah, many different ways. Great question. I think one thing, anthropology came in college. So one of the reasons I chose that, because I walked in wanting to know about people, right? And why we do the things that we do. And anthropology gave me this ability to sort of open 1,000 doors and try to put on different glasses, different lenses to look at people's motivations, inspirations, values, needs, desires, mores. It just struck me as both kind of funny and perfect common sense that according to where we are on this planet at what time, we're going to be different. And I am someone who's swum against the stream quite a bit in my time. That's kind of my MO. And it wasn't the easiest thing to own in the beginning. So it was helpful to be like, culture is the air that we breathe. And if you can gain a certain level of awareness and consciousness around it, you can actually have so much more agency and so much more choice with it. And that's really important with trauma healing, because usually trauma involves our choice being taken away from us in some way. So returning to agency around it is paramount. And spirituality definitely helps me have sort of the widest angle lens, like the biggest context for everything that's happening, because I can always connect back to something that's so much larger than me. and that I am part and parcel of. And that's part of how everything weaves together. It's all about connection, really. That's the thing. That's the thread that is woven through all of my interests, I think.
Your level of spirituality is something that I hope to achieve at some point in time in my life. It's one of those things where I was literally on the brink of, I have a lot of like lower back issues, a lot of tight hip issues. Like I mentioned, the ulcerative colitis thing, which I haven't had problems with in a very long time. And a lot of it is I have realized coming from the childhood and growing up, going into the military, going to war, all these different things that I did throughout my whole life, I realized that my emotional cup was nearly full by the time I went into the military. And then going to war, going to combat actually overfilled that cup. So when I came back, I wasn't the same person as when I left. And I had gotten that feedback from people, I guess a few years after I came back, that I turned into somebody else, somebody different. And I've been trying to seek this spiritual journey in a sense, and through yoga, through meditation and things like that, to try to get myself back to where I used to be, back to who I was before. What would you say would be your pivotal moments that led you to transition from your broadcast journalism career to Eastern medicine and holistic healing practices?
Yeah, I will definitely answer that. I want to acknowledge that it just makes perfect sense to me what you said. And I have questions about whether or not we get back to who we were, or do we cultivate who we're becoming, right? It's not always so entirely separate, but I mean, I ask myself that with all my different threads in my background. In broadcast news, I mean, I totally ate it up. I just absolutely adored it. I loved the adrenaline rush of it. I loved the mission. I loved the people that I was working with. I loved working with sound and radio. But I got really sick. My body just started breaking down. It turns out when you work that much and that hard, and you're absorbing that much trauma without discharging any of it, I mean, I was not aware enough to do that. And I think about this parallel a lot with veterans, actually, because I actually do think that trauma ignites warriorship. So it makes us prepared to be warriors should we choose that in many different forms. And it doesn't mean that we can occupy the same wavelength at the same speed, the same force all the time. I mean, there's still natural rhythms to that, right? And when we're super mission driven, we tend not to listen, I think, right? I mean, I just overrode everything that my body was saying for quite a while. And then it just got to the point where I was like, I'm not actually enjoying my life outside of work. I don't have a life outside of work. I had no balance whatsoever. And I tried to look 10 years down the line and ask myself how I would be doing, how my health would be doing, how my body would be doing. And I mean, the inevitable, obvious answer was, you need a change. So yeah, the body is such an incredible, honest messenger. So I hear that you've been listening to your body too, and that's so commendable. Really awesome.
Well, I was forced to. It's really weird because, especially for veterans and first responders that go through and witness a lot of trauma, sometimes folks will, I guess, make excuses for behaviors and things like that. But I think it takes if you're going to take a higher level of responsibility in a higher position career that's going to deal with trauma, you also have to accept the higher level of accountability and responsibility when it comes to taking care of your mind and your body. And unfortunately, in Western culture, things like meditation, I go back to yoga because I mean it's the most surface thing out there, but it's there, and I think a lot of people don't take advantage of it, right?
Yeah.
What I find really unique is how you combine ancient and contemporary practices from both Eastern and Western traditions. So, would you mind sharing how the integrative approach benefits the folks that you serve?
Not at all. Yeah. I think in some ways, when you're rooted in shamanism and spirituality, it's impossible to not reach back towards ancient wisdom. And I think the benefit of that is you can see actually over time what has survived and even thrived and had a rebirth over and over again. And you can start to pay attention. Yoga is a perfect example. Right. I taught trauma-informed yoga at Home Base, which is a clinic for invisible wounds of war in New England, MGH and Red Sox Foundation joint clinic. And oh man, I loved it so much. It was a lot of mostly dudes, and mostly dudes who had not really tried yoga before. But in terms of the integration of ancient thousands of years, right, of wisdom and practice of yoga as the root. And then modern, I actually think a lot of the trauma-informed perspective that we talk more about these days is new, sort of cutting edge, just another form or another level of consciousness that trauma lives in the body, right? It lives in our nervous systems. We can have very severe, very high level risk events happen to us. We can also have smaller things that are connected to things in our own past happen to us. And either way, the nervous system responds as it does because of who you are and where you are and how your overall health is. So I really love pulling the threads of just sort of, again, the steadiest drum beats over time, like breathing. And if we can regulate our breathing, we can regulate our mind. Pulling that into the present moment and doing it in a trauma-informed way. I tried to help people even be aware of what their breath was doing at first, right? I mean, before you started doing yoga, did you have a sense of, oh man, okay, I really need to catch my breath. I need a pause here. I'm using too much energy. This is like I'm not getting done what I want to get done because I feel restless. Let me try grounding for a second. Like, did you have an awareness of that?
No, I did not.
Me
It
either.
didn't dawn on me until I became an instructor. So I'm a lot of people know, but I'm a firearms instructor. I also have instructed tactics before. Back when I was in the military, I worked as the S3 training officer, and it wasn't until then I realized the importance of breathing and how breathing has everything to do from I was just talking to my niece about this earlier, has a lot to do with the max effort when it comes to running, when it comes to shooting, when it comes to decision making under stress and anxiety. Breathing is the key factor for folks to stay in the fight and also make sound decisions. So it wasn't until that's when I realized the importance of breathing.
Totally get that. Yeah, totally get that. And how universal is it, right? That you're shooting a gun, you're on a yoga mat, breathing is still there, right? It's the thread that goes through both of those things. And something that my shamanic study has helped me realize is that the universe is constantly contracting and expanding, right? And that is what we are doing in microcosm in breathing in and breathing out. So we have the opportunity when we become conscious about that to align with the ultimate expansion and contraction, right? There's sort of no end to how much we can align with that. Sometimes you only have a couple seconds. Sometimes maybe you take an hour out of your day and you're really training yourself to be in that dance. But either way, it's available to you, and it's been true for millennia. So it's a pretty good bet, right?
Yeah. Specifically for veterans, have you worked with a lot of combat veterans?
Yeah.
You have?
Yeah.
Have you seen any type of link or relationship between the veterans' past upbringing, childhood, and also what they did in the military, or perhaps just even being in the military? Have you seen any chain link between that?
I think that's what taught me so much about how trauma ignites warriors. I think I have yet to meet someone who's in the service who didn't have trauma before they enlisted.
Right.
And so,
I can say I personally have my own thoughts on that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people that choose to join the military, a lot of people, not saying every and all, but a lot of people that choose to join the military come from a situation where there wasn't a whole lot of choice. It was either join the military or stay home and get involved in things that probably were not positive. They're not coming from the well-off families. They're coming from middle to lower class families, and that's just the truth. That's why recruiting stations are set up where they are. That leading to a lot of folks joining, having that, like I mentioned earlier about your cup or your emotional cup already being completely full by the time you join, and then you're put in this situation where you're doing things that most others aren't doing, whether it's moving far away from home or it's deploying and things like that,
100%.
Yeah.
I have also worked with a number of operators over the years. And yeah, I think part of the thread that happens that, again, my perspective is as a healer, right? So you can definitely see how if there are wounds in your system that haven't healed, and then you go through combat and there are more wounds and the other wounds get opened, right? Because all trauma delivers a shock to the system. So you can kind of think about it as sort of hitting what was maybe like a pond with few ripples in it, and then causing a whole bunch of ripples and distorted patterns that if you don't do the work of bringing them back together, they're just going to keep hurting you and other people. That's typically how it goes. So many people take on the brave, very, very brave work of slowing down and looking at that stuff. And I would say that's our job on the civilian side. And this is something traditional and indigenous societies did without question, right? People choose the role of warrior. They have to be welcomed back into the tribe. They have to have time with elders to be able to debrief. They need time with healers to be able to cleanse. They need witnessing from the community. And that is how we can actually integrate what has happened. And it doesn't matter from what point, any of the trauma, into our whole self with unconditional love. That's kind of the bottom line that I see. And it's a lot of work, but it takes a lot of support, and there's a lot of support out there.
It is. And one of the things that I think make it most difficult, sometimes it's not about what you necessarily deal with overseas. It's about coming back here. Mm-hmm. And the reason I say that is because I think it's estimated to be less than 5%, 6% of the U.S. population ever serve in the military. And then it's less than 3% that actually ever go to war or go to combat. I think there's something to be said about looking back in history during World War II, and you had the majority of America involved in that in some way, shape, or form. When it was all over and everyone came back here, it was much easier to stand in the room or sit in a room and be surrounded by folks that had a common wall with experience.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the most difficult things for folks to understand that are civilians is sometimes it's not necessarily what you deal with over there. It's coming back here and having to deal with the 95+% that didn't experience that and watched it on the news, and it was a spectator event for them. So,
Hell yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's, again, have we integrated people into the entire process, or are we starting to get more and more separate from the fact that people are still fighting our wars out there, right? I absolutely agree with you. And I do think we need to do better as a whole, as a society. And I do think this is a lot of why you see so much suicide. We are not holding together, and there's no reason for that. That is to our detriment. So I'm a huge proponent of building the bridges as we need to make sure we're clear that we're all in this together.
Right. What is your overall motivation, inspiration with helping first responders and military veterans, service members?
Good question. I actually think it sort of started in news. At least that's where I became conscious of it. And 9/11 was a really influential point in my life. I was at NPR, and it became a very deep wound for me that I wasn't aware that I would experience. And so my own growth of my awareness of my warrior nature sort of grew in parallel to learning more about warriors here. And it just never made sense to me that we were asking so much of people when we hadn't really taken care or good care of people who had already been at war on our behalf. That never sat right with me. So I started to feel like I needed to give back in some way. So yeah, when I got out of school, I had a little bit of seed money and I started a low to no cost acupuncture program for veterans, which was a hard sell. Trust me, I worked really hard to try to tell people how awesome it was, and not being part of the military community. It was, yeah, it's been really hard to sort of break down the necessary doors, but I am stubborn to a fault, so I keep trying.
It's just so non-traditional. Now, with that being said, how do you determine which module is appropriate, such as like acupuncture, Reiki, shamanic practices? Is that how you pronounce that? Are most appropriate for an individual's healing journey?
It's a great question. It really depends on what they come in with. Some people know what I do and they ask right up front. With other people, it's a bit more of an exploration. They know that something needs to shift and it needs to be on more than a physical level. But yeah, it sort of depends on what I have at my disposal. I don't have a physical office anymore. So at the time, then I could sort of choose from all my like needles. My Reiki comes through my hands and my body and my field. So I don't need to have anything other than that. If I'm coaching, I can do it like this or on the phone. But this is, I think, in part where the spiritual lens helps me a lot, because I'm always listening for, no matter what the modality is, what is at the heart of this inquiry, this conflict, this issue or problem for this person, right? Being able to learn to listen to pain as a messenger, and that can be any kind of pain. I figure it out person to person.
Yeah, it's a very individualistic basis, right? And it's also what they're open to. Like you talk about sticking needles in someone, they're not into needles. You're not going to be doing that to them. But overall, with your work in supporting veterans, leaders, and creatives out there, what unique challenges and healing needs do these different groups present, and how do you think you best address them?
That's great. Leaders, warriors, and creatives. Let me try and break it down.
I mean, do they have anything in common, or is it
Yeah,
very
definitely.
much different?
Definitely. I mean, with leaders and warriors, one of the biggest things that I tend to see is that it's really hard to believe as a warrior or a leader that you need to take care of yourself and put your oxygen mask on first. That is something that I get a lot of resistance around until we actually kind of walk through the process and people can have the experience of their own different level of self-regulation and how much better they feel, how much more openly they can show up, how much more they can drop out of their mind and lead from their heart, how much more they're willing to be vulnerable in those spaces. And all of that allows us to hear what's going on for other people much better. And what you mentioned about the transitions coming back home, again, that always made perfect sense to me. I mean, how are we asking people to go from Z to A with no process in between or little process? That's not how we work. That's not how nature works. And we are part and parcel of nature. So, with creatives, there's a lot of people might come forward with feeling stuck, and feeling like they can't really get to their authentic voice. And I would say that is an absolute thread between all of those three groups. That's kind of my jam, right? To be able to help people really hear their authenticity. We're always going to work better out of that place. I've spent a lifetime trying to not work from that place and to be more normal and accepted. And it's just not going to work. When your soul is knocking at the door, it's not something that goes away or that you can ignore.
I would imagine if they come to you, their soul is knocking at the door, because getting them to even come to the table to begin with is the first challenge in itself. And it can be very frustrating when people are their own worst enemy. Now, how do you deal with imposter syndrome?
Oh my gosh, I have so much of it. I had a good friend help me prep for doing more podcasting, and
everybody's a victim of it, right?
Everybody,
to some extent.
And this guy's a veteran too, and he was like, I was like, oh, can I actually get onto veteran podcasts and say anything that's worthwhile? And he was like, well, what would you do if you were just sitting in front of an actual veteran? And I said, I would double down on my authenticity, because if you're feeling like you're out of reach and there's just something really vulnerable or exposing to say, try saying that. I often counsel people to do that. And it works really well, right? Because, I mean, I get it. I think it's the ego that has us try to impress other people. But at the end of the day, and over time, it's not very satisfying, right? So if I feel like I am not an expert in a thing, my new tendency is actually to just say, I am not an expert in this thing. I have this experience. Take it or leave it, right? I mean, something I love about Eastern philosophy is it really says up front, turn this over in your own mind. You don't have to just believe it. Experience it. Embody it, practice it, see how it lands for you. If it doesn't resonate with you, fine, leave it where it is. But if it does, you have the ability to gain mastery in a way that you didn't have before, right? That's pretty cool. Yeah. So doubling down on just what is confronting to me and actually saying it out loud. That's my...
Believing in yourself, right?
Yeah.
Doubling down and believing in yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can be a challenge for sure to break through that threshold, especially if you've never been in the military or first responder career field to speak to that audience. Now, your overall involvement with the Veterans Yoga Project. Let's talk about that. How and overall, like, I guess how mindfulness resiliency works with that in trauma recovery.
Yeah, so I was very happy to get my training in trauma-informed yoga from them. Um, it was, I really did want to teach veterans. It's absolutely my favorite space of teaching for yoga. And so what was nice about them is that they were trying to take the fundamentals of yoga and weave through, again, sort of modern research about what works for veterans in those spaces. I have modified that over the years because of my Indian background. I also do throw a little bit more of the spirituality and the Eastern flavor in there. But I think it was really helpful to teach me how to slow down with people, with veterans, with first responders, and how to meet everyone where they are. So people are going to come into a class with very different things. And at a place like home base, people, some people needed assistance devices. Some people had limbs missing. Some people needed to sit in a chair. Some people were way more flexible than I was, right? I mean, it's the whole gamut of students that you see. So it really actually challenges you to be in a trauma-informed space, which is to say, first and foremost, you're driving this thing. I'm going to be up here and I'll show you the shapes and I'll tell you what they're about. But you are the only person inhabiting your body, and you get to say, this is too much for me right now, or this isn't enough for me right now. I feel like doing this. I don't feel like doing this. So you can come into those classes, and if you want to take child's pose for 10 minutes, if you want to be in Shavasana the whole time, great. You're doing it perfectly, right? And that's a pretty strong value, I think, with Veterans Yoga Project. So,
But how do you challenge people? Like, how do you challenge people? Because the one thing that I always kind of look at it, like if you and I go for a run, for example, how do I push the person next to me to break through that glass ceiling, I guess, and to try new things? Have you figured that out yet?
Yes and no, right? It's like a constant experiment. Right. No, not at all. I mean, it's a great question. Like, what I've noticed is that there are different ways to experience challenge. And honestly, it's less of a challenge to be in a room of male veterans and first responders and be like, okay, let's do this, right? Like, that's not actually a challenge in that space. If I'm asking them to turn the volume up to 11 and go super hard, most people are pretty used to that. Depending on injury, right, and illness, you may not be, but there's a quieter, subtler level of challenge that I also have tried to meet people at, which is, can you pause? Can you choose to not override your pain? Yes, it sucks that you can't do what everyone else is doing right now. Can you try to breathe into that and be with that? That's a different kind of challenge, right? But it's still a challenge, sometimes even greater. Right?
It's almost like a disclaimer. Like, before you start something, you got to tell people that to really push yourselves. Don't stay where you're comfortable necessarily, but let's try to achieve and progress each time. And don't just lay in child pose the whole time. Don't just run at your own pace, but let's try to break through some different thresholds to just see some, I guess, overall progress in what you're trying to achieve, right?
Totally depends on the person. Absolutely. For some people, being in child's pose at all is a total mark of progress because they've never let themselves rest. And this took me a while to, I have the same thing, right? I'm very mission driven. And if I'm not doing it right, I'm not doing it at all, kind of thing. But that's where you have to really create this space. As a teacher, you actually have to embody that however people show up and whatever they do is okay. And there's a lot of wisdom, like shamanic, indigenous, Eastern wisdom about that. There's always something to work on, and it doesn't have to look any particular way. It's kind of what is showing up for you, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, it makes total sense. So overall, you've specialized in treating trauma, PTSD, and emotional disorders. What would you say are some effective strategies that you found for transforming trauma into clarity and peace? To take that fog away from, because I know for me, for a lot of years, my deployment was, I describe it as like a sleepwalk. And the most frustrating part for me for many years was the difficulty of explaining myself. Everything felt very foggy. So what would you say would be some effective strategies besides coming to the table that you found for transforming trauma into clarity and peace, would you say?
Yeah, I hear that. And that's actually a great example, because I think a lot of people experience that fogginess and explaining yourself, telling your story. One thing I find very, very helpful is to bookend your day with practice. So spiritual practice, mindful practice, however it is you want to contextualize it, you're actually taking real time and intention to sit down and focus on another thing. Breathing, we have it, right? If we're here and we're walking around, fantastic. For some people, it's a yoga practice. It's some kind of ritual. And you do it at the times of day when there is still a little bit of quietness or return to quietness in the world. And that, again, helps you line up with the bigger energy of it. I would definitely recommend meditation and yogic breathing practices. Being able to reset with breathing and meditation. Something else just popped into my head, so I have to say that too. There are definitely super helpful plant medicines to support us with rewiring what's going on in there. And a lot of that rewiring is, if you can do it in the right context and support, part of unraveling the knots of trauma and being able to pull out the threads and say, you know what? Okay, I'm actually done with this behavior. That doesn't serve me anymore. But I'm really going to keep this part of me that has something to say, and I'm going to put it into writing or painting or sculpture or some kind of art. Often, a certain level of physical activity, moving your body, and being conscious with your breath. A lot of people are doing that already. So a tweak there could be intentionality. Mm-hmm. If you're running and you are maybe listening to something around visualization, or you're doing mantras, or whatever it is, you're trying something totally new, you're going surfing for the first time, or
right.
Yeah, there's a lot that
I think one of the biggest things that you're fighting against is the concept, especially here in America, where everybody wants to take the wonder pill. So I have lower back issues. Well, easy. Painkillers. Take painkillers, right? Versus the long-term, because there's always a teeter and a totter to those things, versus the long-term, I guess, more natural way of handling things by breathing, relaxing, learning how to let go. I think in Western culture, we have a tendency to just simply take that pill or press that button and it's fixed, right? Do you see a lot of people, a lot of times, try to go about a spiritual journey or try to find a more natural way to solve their issues, and then they just simply give up because it's taking too long and then it's out of frustration? What do you do for that?
Great question. I don't see so much full sail giving up. I definitely see the very human dance of one step forward, two steps back. And, these things can work together. There's no shame in taking an aspirin or a painkiller on a day when you really need some support and everything else just isn't working. I definitely have patients and clients who take SSRIs and all of that stuff. It can all work together. I think the thing to remember is, are you addressing the root of the tree or the branches, right? Because on those days when NSAIDs and painkillers help us, that's great. Sometimes you just need that support, but over time and at a deep level, is that actually getting to why you have this pain? All right, what's the root of that pain? When does it come up? What is it saying to you? I ask that question a lot to people. And people who have never done it before, if you just slow down enough and are quiet and mindful enough and willing enough, you can hear it. So that is part of how I counter that. Yeah, you're very right. I think even, having been on this path for 3 decades or more at this point, there are definitely times when it gets so hard and I am on my knees that I would like to have some cosmic version of that pill, right? But the chance of it happening over again and of us missing the lesson and not actually transforming it are pretty huge. So if you get a nudge that's repetitive, I think it's usually an invitation to do something radically different.
Yeah. I think for me, a lot of times when it comes to veterans, I try to warn them to be self-aware. A lot of times you'll hear a pattern. So for example, you go through a divorce, you'll hear your ex say this. You have friends that say the same thing. Over the years, you hear the same common theme. And I think for some veterans and first responders out there, it's time to kind of look in the mirror and ask yourself, like, why do I have these problems over and over again in different situations and different scenarios when I'm the common denominator here? And it's not that you're wrong or that you're bad or anything like that, but you got to be critical about yourself and how you're behaving and what you're doing, and stop putting it on other people. And that's the one thing that I think over the years, and me being a veteran, I can talk to veterans that way. I can talk to them in a way like where it's a little bit more rougher, I think, than folks who are not a part of the, I guess, of that career family. And I want to mention this too, is I've given people the advice over the years to not wait until you are at your brink. I gave advice to a niece of mine who grew up with a lot of childhood trauma. She's in her early 20s. I gave her advice. I said, you need to go seek therapy now. Don't wait until you're 30 years old and all those things that you've internalized and you've kept inside just come out again, because it'll be like vomit. It'll just come right out. It's better that you start dealing with the issues that you've had growing up, instead of putting them away, versus just letting everything just explode inside of you. And 100%. I think a lot of times we need to give people that type of advice. We're not doing enough mentoring, enough coaching each other. We're too afraid to have those conversations. But I have so many more questions for you, but I know that we're getting up to an hour, and before we get off here, I want to make sure that I cover some of your upcoming projects and initiatives that you have. From my understanding, you have some things coming up with Soulful Healing and Counseling, as well as Edgewalkers Healing Cooperative. Is that right?
True, and sort of all TBD. One thing that is going to be an offshoot, I think, of Soulful Healing and Counsel is this Sacred Outlaws approach, which is really me stepping into swimming against the stream and doing it on behalf of disrupting the status quo for the highest and best, right? So that is sort of an approach, a lens, and maybe a thing with a name that's coming. There's more. I support people with prep and integration coaching who are stepping into medicine journeys. So more of that. I am taking an exam to get the first level of certification with the International Coaching Federation next week. So yeah, there's a lot down the pike. A lot of working with men in various groups to learn mindfulness and grounding and spirituality. So I will keep everyone posted, mostly on Instagram, about that stuff.
Got to fight that imposter syndrome, right? You belong where you belong. And at the end of the day, I really appreciate all the work that you've done for our veteran and first responder community and recognizing the importance enough to face some of your energy in that direction to help us out. I really appreciate that. And over the next few years, how do you envision the evolution of integrative healing practices?
For society, for all of us?
For society, yes.
I think we're going to keep turning more to them, honestly. And thank you for that. Thank you for trusting me and having a conversation with me. It's been amazing. I think we're going to keep turning more to it because we are, I think, going to be called to knowing ourselves more deeply. And again, it's very hard to do that if you're always working at the branch level of the tree, right? Like to get to the root, we're going to have to actually like inhabit our bodies. We don't do that all the time. We are going to have to embody the principles and the values that we are studying. We're going to have to learn how to talk to each other and be intimate with each other in ways that really work and are healing. I think we've probably had our full, hopefully, of so much conflict. And what you mentioned before, actually, about not standing in responsibility for yourself and your life, that's a pretty big part of it, as far as I can see. So my hope and my sense is that there will be more and more people starting to turn into it.
Yeah.
Be curious about it. Yeah.
And I think over the years we've slowly crept in that direction. People are more mindful now of the dangers of the teeter and the totter of prescription medication, illegal drugs, what that can do to you. I mean, it's still a lot of victims still, and I don't mean to like put prescription drugs. They have a place, right? But we all know that they're the number one most abused drugs. Between them and legal drugs is the prescription drugs that people do. But I'm also hopeful, like you, that we start creeping towards a more positive way to take care of our minds and our bodies, just through the different, I guess, events that we've been through, whether it's 9/11 or Iraq or Afghanistan, in my lifetime anyways, that we've dealt with. We're a little more open to these new things, new ideas. Now, I have so many more questions for you, and I hope this is the last time I see you. I hope that you're willing to come back on the podcast again, because I have some more questions for you. I do find your work very fascinating, and I highly appreciate it. But was there anything that I didn't mention during this podcast that you would like to talk about or mention?
Oh. So, I mean, yeah, I feel like we could keep going. And I think I might resist the urge right now to analyze whether or not I've said everything. Yeah, I think the thing that we always talk around is love. It really actually does come down to loving yourself unconditionally and knowing yourself as love. And that's a whole other show or 10, right? But I get shy about saying that because I know that it can be seen as weak or woo-woo or out there. But I am 100% confident that whatever path you travel down, you will find that most of the answers, if not all, are there. So that's the only thing I'd add.
Yeah, that sounds like a whole nother episode in itself, right? So,
Yeah.
no, I really appreciate you. And what's the best way? What's your poison as far as social media? What's the best way that folks can follow you and find out what's the latest on all that is Athena?
So I do mostly Instagram. I have a work Instagram that's Soulful Healing and Counsel. That's COUNCIL. On Insta, I do also have a music one that's just my full name, and I have a music website that's like that too. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm so happy to connect with anyone on either of those places. My contact info is there if anyone was intrigued by anything that we brought up and wants to talk more. I'm always here for it.
I didn't even touch on your musical background, which I had questions on that as well, but we'll say that for another time. And I'll make sure that in the show notes, I put all your different social medias down there for folks out there listening. If you're interested in following Athena, go down to the show notes if this is a podcast. If it's on YouTube, you can find it right there in the notes below. I'll make sure I put it in the description of the video. But thank you so much, Athena. It's been a very spiritual conversation. And the last interview I had was with a first responder, and we were talking about, showing up to the scenes of accidents and having like an arm over here or a leg over there and things like that. And it's been a tremendous opportunity to talk to you today.
Same here. Thank you so, so much for your generosity and your curiosity and your trust. It is an honor.
I love these conversations. I truly do. And it's something that I hope that this was just a conversation and you were able to feel comfortable during this entire episode. Because I know it can be a very tricky thing, because sometimes different experiences with the veteran community, first responder community, it can be a sensitive topic at times. So thank you for tackling this with me. And for everyone else out there, I hope you enjoyed the show. As always, I want you to stay tuned, stay focused, and stay motivated. Warriors, fall out. Thank you for joining us on TMF Podcast. We hope you found today's episode insightful and inspiring. Our mission is to help you strive, thrive, and survive in all aspects of life. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe. Please leave us a review and share it with your network. Stay connected with us on social media as well, and visit our website for more resources. Until next time, I want you to stay tuned, stay focused, and stay motivated. Warriors, fall out.